Bishops love open diagonals where they can quickly move from one side of the board to the other. One drawback to the bishop is that it can only move on one color square for the entire game. When you have two bishops working together, look out. The two bishops are deadly in open positions, where they can completely dominate the board. Notice in this position, Black's king is locked in a diagonal prison. The king is completely dominated The biggest rivalry in chess is between the knight and the bishop. The bishop is a fast, long-range piece and loves open positions where it can travel across the board in a single move. The knight, on the other hand, is a slower, short-range piece, dancing between light and dark squares. Knights prefer closed positions, where they can maneuver around the board and find advanced squares where they can attack several targets at once. Let's take a look at some classic bishop versus knight battles. In this endgame position, material is equal, but the game itself is far from equal. In this closed position, white has several advanced pawns in black's territory, and black's bishop is passively sitting on c8, trying to help prevent white's advanced queenside pawns on a5 and b6 from advancing up the board. Notice that all of black's pawns are on light squares, which makes it difficult for the bishop to find an open diagonal to use. White's knight, on the other hand, can freely move around the board in this closed position, looking for advanced squares to target black's pieces. If you could put your knight anywhere, which square would you choose? Did you think about the d6 square, where it is anchored by the e5 pawn and can never be attacked by an enemy pawn? This is known as an outpost square, and notice that a knight on d6 would attack both the c8 bishop and the b7 pawn at the same time. You know where you want your knight to be. Now how do you get it there? White clears the path for the knight by playing c5. White only needs 2 moves to get to the dominating d6 square. Let's say black tries to advance the kingside pawn majority with h6. After knight to c4, g5, white can simply ignore black's slow plan on the kingside and play knight to d6, threatening to win the bishop. So after bishop to d7, knight takes b7, white will simply play knight d6 on the next turn, when white's queenside pawns will be unstoppable. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, black's bishop enjoys the long dark square diagonal h8 to a1. White's knight is passively placed on d1, and black can completely dominate the knight by protecting all of the squares the knight can use to move. Can you find the bishop move that completely paralyzes white's knight on d1? That's right, with bishop d4. Black's bishop imprisons the d1 knight, prepared to capture the knight if it ever moves. Notice that black has the simple plan of advancing the king up the board and capturing the a5 and b6 pawns, creating 2 passed pawns on the queenside. Black's bishop easily wins this battle against the knight. As we said before, open positions typically favor the bishop. In this position, both sides have passed pawns racing up the board. With black to move, black can promote first, but will rush to defeat after a2, h7, and a1 equals queen. Black promotes first, but the new queen is short-lived after h8 equals queen, skewering the king and the queen. Once the king moves, white captures black's queen. What should black have done instead? The bishop advantage in an open position is only a real advantage if you use it. In this position, black has the incredibly strong bishop to c2. It prevents white's pawns from advancing, and it also prevents white's knight from checking black's king. When there are pawns on 2 sides of the board, this is usually an advantage for the bishop because a bishop can control multiple sides of the board at once. By spending 1 move to eliminate white's counterplay, black is now easily winning after knight to g4 and a2. White plays knight to e3. White's knight desperately tries to eliminate the bishop in order to free the passed pawns. Black can simply ignore this threat and promote to a queen and win the game. But black can also play bishop to e4 check, moving away from the knight's attack and still preventing white's pawns from advancing. Black will promote on the next move and should win easily. Let's take a look at another position. When all of the pawns are on one side of the board, this usually favors the knight as the knight is a short-range piece and is most effective when it only has to control one area of the board. Black's pawn on c4 is the key target. If white's knight can fork both the king and c4 pawn, white will win the pawn, and with it, the game. How can white's knight safely travel to d6 and fork the king and c4 pawn? That's right, with knight e8. And after bishop e2, knight d6 check, white forks the king and c4 pawn, forcing the black king to move away its protection of the c4 pawn. After king b6, knight takes c4 check, white creates a passed pawn and will likely pick up black's last pawn on b3 with a winning game. Let's take a look at another position. In a bishop versus knight battle, it is important for the knight to find an active post where it can control multiple key squares. White plays knight to b4, with the plan of centralizing the knight on d5. When fighting against the knight, you should do your best to prevent it from finding good, advanced squares to land on, such as the d5 square. Can you see how you can prevent white's knight from becoming active? That's right, with e6. Now that the knight is denied access to advanced squares in black's territory, black's bishop on e5, enjoying the long diagonal, is the much better piece. After knight to d3, white hopes to trade the less effective knight for black's bishop, but is disappointed after bishop to d4. Black's bishop dominates the dark squares in white's territory, which gives black the better game. Let's take a look at a similar position, but with a couple of differences. Notice that black's pawn has moved to e5 and black's bishop is on g7. These two differences are enough to swing the bishop versus knight battle to white's advantage. Black's bishop is now passive, blocked behind the several pawns on dark squares. White's knight has the great outpost square d5 and leaps at the chance to move there with knight to b4. Black's best chance is to try and advance the h6 and g5 pawns up the board, taking more space and opening up some dark squares for black's passive bishop. A big mistake for black is to play a5. This move is a mistake, not only because it forces white to move the knight to a square where it wanted to go anyway, the d5 square. By moving the a6 pawn, notice the b5 square is a new outpost square that the knight can use later in the game. After knight to d5, the knight enjoys the d5 outpost square, where it controls several squares in black's territory, and it cannot be removed by any piece other than the more valuable rook. White's knight dominates black's bishop. Now that you've learned about the biggest rivalry on the chessboard, bishop versus knight, it's your turn to join the bishop versus knight battle. As your chess game improves, so does the strength of your competition. When your opponent is no longer dropping material or falling for easy traps, it's not so easy to win. In order to break down your opponent's defenses, you need your pieces to work together to rip open lines, create weaknesses, and break through together as a team. One of the best attacking strategies is the battery. A battery is when two or more pieces work together on the same diagonal, file, or rank to rip open lines of defense. In this position, notice White's bishop on c2 is pointing at the vulnerable h7 square. If we can add another piece to the b1 to h7 diagonal, we will have set up a battery against Black's kingside. White's queen can join the attack on d3 or b1. Where should the queen move? Let's try setting up a battery behind the bishop first with queen to b1. The queen-bishop battery is now threatening to open up lines around Black's king and gain a pawn with bishop takes h7 check. After knight to f6, Black defends against the battery and improves the position of the knight. White can attack the defender with bishop to g5. But Black calmly plays h6, attacking the bishop and removing the pawn from the vulnerable h7 square. White can remove the guard with bishop takes f6 and bishop takes f6. And even though White can play bishop h7 check, Black can simply play king to h8. White has gained nothing from having the queen behind the bishop in the queen-bishop battery, and notice White's rook on a1 is now stuck in the corner because the queen is in its way. Let's take a look at this position again. Let's try putting the queen in front of the bishop, a far more effective battery. After queen to d3, White develops the queen, connects the rooks on the back rank, and most importantly, threatens checkmate on h7. If Black defends in the same way with knight f6, White can play bishop to g5. Black's kingside is under serious pressure. Black's best move is to play the weakening g6, preventing checkmate but creating weak squares around the Black king that can be targets for attack. If Black tries to defend in the same way when the queen was behind the bishop with h6, Black's position collapses after bishop takes f6, removing the defender. White at least wins a piece because after bishop takes f6, the queen-bishop battery crashes through with queen h7. Checkmate. Let's take a look at another position. In this position, White's rook on h1 is putting pressure on Black's h7 pawn. Notice that White's rook on d2 isn't really doing anything on that square. Can that rook become more active by setting up a battery on the h-file? Absolutely. After rook d to h2, Black is in trouble as White is threatening to break through the defenses by playing bishop takes f6 and then rook takes h7. Black does not have a good defense against this threat, as h6 still runs into bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and the rook battering ram crashes through Black's defenses with rook takes h6. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, White will destroy Black's defenses using a combination of batteries. White first uses the queen-bishop battery to attack Black's important dark square defender of the king, the bishop on g7. After bishop to h6, White has the simple plan of capturing Black's bishop and then bringing the queen into the attack using the h6 square. If Black plays knight takes d4, hoping to distract White's queen from the attack, White simply ignores Black's knight and plays the powerful bishop takes g7. If Black recaptures the bishop with king takes g7, White's queen leads the attack with queen h6 check. And after king g8, White attacks the guard of the h7 square, the knight, with g5. If Black tries to break up the queen-rook battery with knight h5, White rips open Black's kingside defenses with the sacrifice rook takes h5. And after g takes h5, can you see how White can break through Black's defenses? Now that the g6 square has been opened, White pushes forward with g6. White threatens checkmate on h7, and notice that the f7 pawn is pinned by White's bishop. After h takes g6, White finishes the attack with queen takes g6 check, taking advantage of the pinned f7 pawn. After king h8, queen takes h5 check, king g7, queen g5 check, Black is forced to the h-file. After king h7, rook h1 check, and bishop h3. White wins the game with rook takes h3. Checkmate. If Black doesn't capture the dark squared bishop and captures another piece with knight takes b3, White's kingside attack is unstoppable after queen h6. White threatens bishop takes f6, when the queen-rook battery destroys Black's defenses. Let's explore one more idea together. One of the most dangerous batteries is the queen and 2-rook battery. There are several ways to arrange this battery. Which setup is best? It depends on the position, but in general, the queen is not a great piece to lead the battery if a sacrifice is necessary. In this position, notice that White would have to sacrifice the queen in order to open up the g-file, which is too much material to offer if there isn't a clear winning line of attack. Often the best arrangement is a rook, queen, and rook battery. The first rook can be used as a battering ram to blast open defensive lines, which then opens up the great attacking powers of the queen. In this position, White can play rook takes g7. The rook is untouchable, as knight takes g7 would allow mate in 1 with queen takes g7. Notice that White is also threatening rook g8, which would also lead to checkmate. Black's best chance is to try knight f6, protecting the g8 square and connecting Black's back rank pieces. Unfortunately for Black, the battering ram strikes again with rook takes h7 check. And no matter if Black captures with the king or the knight, let's use the knight with knight takes h7, White ends the game immediately with queen g7 checkmate. The third queen and 2-rook battery possibility is having the 2 rooks in front with the queen supporting from behind. In this position, world champion Alexander Alekhine, also known as Alekhine, set up what is now known as Alekhine's gun. 2 rooks leading the attack with the queen supporting the battery from behind. White has a lot of pressure on the c-file against Black's pinned knight on c6. White plays the strange-looking rook to c3. Why would White play this move? We'll soon see. After queen to d7, Alekhine's opponent, Grandmaster Aaron Nimzowitsch, may have felt confident that he had enough defensive resources to keep his position safe. White now plays rook 1 to c2, loading Alekhine's gun. After king to f8 and queen to c1, Alekhine's gun is fully loaded and ready to win the piece on c6. After rook b to c8, Black has 4 defenders versus White's 4 attackers against the c6 knight. Alekhine's next move decides the game. He played the quiet bishop to a4. Since the c6 knight is pinned, Alekhine is ready to win the knight with b5. There is not a good way to prevent this plan, and Nimzowitsch soon resigned. Now that you've learned the power of batteries, it's your turn to try blasting open lines of attack. How often do you have your opponent right on the edge of defeat, but you're not sure how to finish the game? This happens to all of us, especially in endgames. In rook endgames, if you are able to get a rook on the 7th rank, your opponent is usually in trouble. If you're able to get 2 rooks on the 7th rank, look out. 2 rooks on the 7th rank are incredibly powerful, and they are known as pigs on the 7th because they capture everything in their path. In this position, white has more space on the queen side and more active rooks, but black is barely holding on. After white plays rook to d7, white invades the 7th rank and attacks the b7 pawn. After black defends with rook a to b8, white's second rook invades the 7th rank with rook f to f7. White's rooks attack both b7 and g7. If black attempts to trade one of these powerful rooks with rook f8, the pigs on the 7th finish the game quickly with rook takes g7 check, king h8, rook takes h7 check. The rook quickly captures 2 pawns, and after king g8, white's other rook delivers checkmate with rook d to g7, checkmate. Let's take a look at another position. In this position, black would love to invade white's 2nd rank, but notice that white's knight on c3 protects both squares where black's rooks could invade the 2nd rank, e2 and a2. Black comes up with the plan of removing the knight with bishop takes c3, but first plays the incredibly accurate bishop d4 check. Black forces the king into the corner, where it is out of the action and can later be vulnerable to back-rank checkmate. After king h1, black now captures the knight with bishop takes c3. And after b takes c3, black captures a pawn and invades the 2nd rank with rook takes a2. After rook d3, black's other rook invades the 2nd rank with rook e to e2. The pigs are in full control of the action. After rook to g1, black has several good ideas, including the simple rook to a4, which wins a 2nd pawn. Let's take a look at one more example together. With white to move, white has a comfortable position with a healthy 2 versus 1 pawn majority on the queen side, compared to black's 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the king side that is restricted by the doubled g pawns. White's best plan is to play rook to c2, preventing black's rooks from invading the 2nd rank, and then trying to advance the queenside pawn majority up the board. Instead of this, white gets excited to get pigs on the 7th rank with rook to c7. White expects black to defend passively with rook to b8. When after rook d to d7 and rook g8, white dominates the game after rook takes b7. White's 2 connected passed pawns should win the game. Let's return to the position after white played rook to c7. After rook to c7, black should not play passively. Whenever possible, if you can defend actively, this is usually your best chance to stay in the game. After the far more active move, rook to e2, black invades the 2nd rank and prepares to counterattack white. After rook d to d7, white has pigs on the 7th, but black fights back by playing the same idea, rook f to f2. Even though white attacks first with rook takes g7, black will always at least have a perpetual check with rook g2 check, king to f1, rook g to f2 check, and white cannot escape the checks after king g1 and rook g2 check. Black saved the game by using active defense. After learning about the strength of the 2 rooks on the 7th rank, it's your turn to use pigs on the 7th. One of the most exciting tactics in chess is known as the windmill. Just like the blades of a windmill, this tactic goes around and around, destroying everything in its path. In this position, Mexican Grandmaster Carlos Torre has the white pieces against former world champion Emanuel Lasker. White's rook on g3 is lined up with black's king on the g-file. White would love to open up this rook and attack the g7 pawn with bishop to f6, but notice that black's queen pins the bishop to white's queen on the 5th rank. Grandmaster Torre teaches us that we must look deeper than just the surface of a tactic and plays the incredible bishop to f6. White sacrifices his queen, but knows he will regain it with a winning position using the windmill tactic. After queen takes h5, in rook g7 check, black's king is forced to h8. This is the beginning of the windmill tactic. White could regain the queen with rook to g5, discovering a check on the king, but there is a much stronger move. White played rook takes f7 check. White captures a pawn and discovers the bishop attack against black's king. After king to g8, white's rook returns to g7 with rook g7 check, forcing black's king to move to a discovered attack square with king to h8. As you can see, a windmill tactic can have an endless number of discovered checks. White uses this tactic to gain as much material as possible after rook takes b7 check. Black is forced to play king g8, and the windmill returns with rook g7 check. After king h8, white decides not to capture the a7 pawn because it would open up the a-file for black's rook. Grandmaster Torre regains his queen and ends the windmill tactic with rook g5 check. And after king h7, rook takes h5, black does get to fork white's rook and bishop with king g6. But after rook h3, king takes f6, white plays rook takes h6 check. After Torre's incredible windmill tactic, white is now up 3 pawns. Winning this position was no challenge for a player of Torre's strength. Let's take a look at another example of the windmill. In this position, black appears to be in serious trouble. Not only is black down an incredible amount of material, white is also threatening checkmate on the next move with bishop takes g7. Unfortunately for white, black has the incredible windmill tactic that will destroy most of white's pieces. The windmill attack begins after rook g3 check. The discovered check forces white's king to h2. And after rook g2 check, king h1, black gains another pawn with rook takes g4 check. And after king h2, let's watch the windmill destroy all of white's pieces on the 2nd rank after rook g2 check, king h1, black captures a pawn with rook takes c2 check, and after king g1, rook g2 check, king h1, black now wins a bishop after rook takes b2 check. King g1, rook g2 check, king h1, black wins another pawn with rook takes a2 check, and after king g1, black concludes the windmill tactic with rook takes a1. Black went from what looked like a hopeless position to a completely winning position. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, white is currently down a rook, but white's dark squared bishop and rook on g1 put great pressure on the g7 pawn directly in front of black's king. Black's queen on h6 does defend that square, so white wants to remove the queen as a defender of g7 and plays the incredible queen h3. This deflection tactic distracts black's queen from its defense of g7. After queen takes h3, in rook g7 check, after king h8, white could play the discovered check rook to g3 to regain the queen immediately, but remember, black was already up a rook, so this wouldn't make the most of the windmill tactic. After rook takes f7 check, and king g8, we see the familiar windmill setup again with rook g7 check and king h8. It is tempting to automatically play rook takes d7, discovered check, and continue the windmill tactic. But now that the pawn on f7 has been captured, do you notice that white's bishop on b3 is pointing at the g8 square? This means that white's rook can end the windmill and deliver a discovered double check, checkmate, with rook g8. Checkmate. White's two bishops and rook work together to deliver a beautiful checkmate to end the game. Now that you've learned the power of the windmill, it's your turn to give it a try. One of the most When playing the opening phase of a chess game, we are used to typical advice such as control the center, develop your pieces quickly, and castle. In the endgame, we can also learn typical guidelines to help our play, including don't rush, activate your king, and rooks belong behind passed pawns. Let's take a look at some endgame positions and learn how to best handle each situation. One of the most important endgame guidelines is don't rush. In this position, white has two connected passed pawns and should win the game. Although black has no chances to win, always look out for your opponent's counterplay that could ruin your winning game. White decides to rush forward with b6. White has no sense of danger in this position. Notice the pawn on b6 is on the same diagonal as white's king on d4. Black now shocks white by playing bishop a7. Black sacrifices the bishop in order to enter a completely drawn position. Black is prepared to capture the b6 pawn, so if white captures the bishop with b takes a7, after king takes a7, white's a pawn will be captured on the next move. If white tries to guard the pawn, let's say with king c5, black can now enter a completely drawn endgame with bishop takes b6 check. The point of this sacrifice is that after king takes b6, in king b8, black is forced a classic rook pawn and wrong-colored bishop endgame. When you have a rook pawn, meaning a pawn on the h-file or a-file, if the promotion square is the opposite color as the bishop, this is a drawn endgame if the opponent's king can block the promotion square. Black's king will sit in the corner, moving between b8 and a8. There is no way to force the black king out. The game is drawn. Let's go back and see what white should have done instead. Since black has no threats in the position and is only trying to draw, white should be in no rush. One good endgame idea is to activate your king. White can improve the position of the king by playing king d5. And after black plays a waiting move, such as bishop g3, white plays king c6. White's king is very active and is ready to advance the pawns up the board. After bishop f2, should white rush forward and play b6? After b6, this would be a huge mistake because black can once again sacrifice the bishop with bishop takes b6, entering the same rook pawn and wrong bishop endgame. White simply has to prevent this trick by playing bishop to c5. White offers to trade bishops and win the king and pawn endgame. Black avoids the trade with bishop g3, and white is now ready to play b6. White waited to push the pawn to b6 until all of white's pieces were actively placed and when black did not have any counterplay. White is already threatening b7 check, followed by a7 checkmate. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, both sides have two connected passed pawns, and it looks like a difficult endgame battle lies ahead. With white to move, rather than rushing to figure out what to do, it is always useful to ask, what does my opponent want to play? Black could advance a pawn to a4, or develop the knight to c6 or d7. Notice that all three of these moves are on the a4 to e8 diagonal. White can completely prevent black's counterplay by taking over that diagonal with bishop to b5. By preventing black's counterplay, white's plan to advance the two passed pawns with the help of the king now becomes much stronger. Let's take a look at another position. In this position, both sides have equal material. White's bishop on c5 is active, and black's knight does not have a good way to move into white's position. You may think white's position is better, but one of the most important endgame tips to remember is that the king is an active piece. When most of the danger has been removed from the board, the king can become the strongest endgame piece. Notice that white has an unprotected pawn on a3, and black's king has a clear path to attack it. White's king, on the other hand, may have been safely tucked in the corner earlier when queens and rooks were on the board, but now it is poorly placed for the endgame. After king f7, black's king marches toward the weak a3 pawn. White tries to activate the king, and after king g1, king e6, king f2, and king d5. If white continues to try and bring the king to the defense of the queenside pawns, black's king will win the race. After king e3, king c4, king d2, and king b3, black will capture the a3 pawn and should win the endgame with careful play. Let's consider another defensive try for white. Instead of trying to move the king to the queenside, what if white tries to protect the a3 pawn with the bishop? After bishop e3, king c4, bishop c1, and king b3, it looks like white is hanging on after king e2. The power of the more active king is shown after king to c2. Black attacks the bishop, forcing it to move. After bishop d2, black wins the a3 pawn with king b2. Black attacks the pawn and also prevents white's bishop from returning to the c1 square. In the endgame, always remember, the king is an active piece. Let's take a look at another position. One of the most important weapons in the endgame is a passed pawn. White's pawn is only one square away from promoting. In rook and pawn endgames, you typically want your rook behind the passed pawn. In this position, white's rook is in front of the pawn, and black immediately moves the rook behind the pawn with rook g5. This prevents white from moving the rook out of the pawn's way to promote, so white's rook is stuck defending the pawn. After king to h4, black's rook moves as far away from the white king as possible on the g-file with rook to g1. After king h5, white is hoping to protect the pawn with the king, so white can then move the rook out of the pawn's way to promote. Black must be patient in this position. A serious blunder would be to try and bring the black king toward the enemy pawn with king to c7. This allows the winning tactic, rook a8. White is threatening to promote the pawn on the next turn, and notice if black plays rook takes g7, white wins the rook with the skewer rook a7 check. As long as black keeps the king on the b7 or a7 squares, rook a8 is never a threat. Black should now wait patiently by playing rook to g2, waiting for white to protect the pawn with the king. After king h6, white is ready to move the rook on the next turn to promote the pawn. But now black can begin checking white's king with rook h2 check. After king g6, rook g2 check, king f7, black continues to check white's king with rook f2 check. As long as white's king continues to protect the pawn, Black's rook will also keep delivering checks. Once the king moves away from the pawn, such as king e7, Black's rook returns to the g-file with rook g2, preventing White's rook from leaving the promotion square. White cannot make progress, and the game is a draw. Let's take a look at a similar position with one big difference. In this position, Black's rook is now in front of the pawn, and White's rook is behind it. Remember, both for attacking and defending, rooks generally are much better behind passed pawns than in front of them. Rooks behind passed pawns have much more space to move, so a defender can use that space to check the enemy king and stay on an important file. When a rook is in front of the pawn, it has much less space available and often runs out of squares. After king h6, if Black attempts to protect the rook with king f8, White has the powerful move rook f2 check. Since Black's king must stay in contact with the rook, Black plays king g8. And now White can win the game by playing rook a2. White is threatening checkmate on a8, and there is no good defense for Black. After king h6, if Black retreats with rook g8, White's active king marches forward with king h7. Black's rook runs out of squares to defend against White's pawn. Since king f8 loses to rook f2 check, after Black plays rook f8, White wins easily with g7. Black can no longer defend against White's pawn and will lose the game. Now that you've learned important endgame guidelines, it's time to test your endgame skills. When opening a chess game, knights and bishops usually jump right into action. The rooks often have to wait, limited to helping pawns advance up the board, waiting for their chance to enter the game. Sometimes, rooks only find their full strength in later middle game and endgame positions, when more pieces get traded off, clearing space for the rooks to move across the board. Rooks are very powerful pieces in the endgame, and knowing their strengths and limitations can be the difference between winning or losing a chess game. Let's explore the powers of the rook in the endgame. In this position, the rook is battling white's passed pawn, which is only 3 squares away from promoting. A single pawn is usually no match for the powerful rook, but since black's king is completely out of the action, white's king and pawn working together can be a serious challenge for the rook. With white to move, it is very important to keep the king and pawn connected to fight against the rook together. So white plays king f4, moving the king up the board to help escort the pawn to the promotion square. Black's rook has a few choices, but the game should be a draw with accurate play from white. If black tries to cut off the king by playing rook to c5, white's pawn marches forward with g6. And if black tries to attack the pawn with rook to c6, if white rushes forward with g7, black's rook has separated the king and the passed pawn and now wins easily after rook g6, winning the pawn on the next turn. After rook c6, instead of pushing the pawn too far away from the king, white should keep the pawn and king together by playing king f5. White is now ready to play g7, when black's rook will have to sacrifice itself for the advanced pawn. If black tries to bring the king into the game with king b2, after g7, black's rook is forced to the back rank with rook c8. White's king marches up the board with king f6, and after king c3, king f7, black will have to sacrifice the rook for the passed pawn on the next turn, or draw the game with a perpetual check after rook c7 check, king f8, rook c8 check, king f7. Let's see if black had another way to try and win this endgame. Black can also try rook f1 check, and after king e5, black separates the king from the pawn, but the rook cannot both keep the king cut off from the pawn and prevent white's pawn from promoting. White draws the game by marching the king and pawn up the board, rank by rank, until black's rook will have to sacrifice itself for the pawn. If black tries to bring the king into the action with king b2, both sides continue with their plans after g6, king c3, and g7. Black's rook is now forced to prevent the pawn from promoting with rook g1, allowing white to connect the king and pawn with king f6. If black's king were in front of the pawn, this position would be easily winning for black. Since black's king is so far out of the action, white draws after king d4 and king f7. White is threatening to promote the pawn on the next turn, and black will need to sacrifice the rook. Let's take a look at this position again, except this time it will be black to move. We saw with white to move, the teamwork of the king and pawn was enough to draw against black's powerful rook and out-of-place king. With black to move, is the position still drawn? Can you see how black can cut off the white king from the passed pawn? That's right, by playing rook to c4. White's king can no longer help advance the pawn up the board. White loses quickly after g6. Now that the pawn cannot be protected by the king on the next turn, black wins the game with rook c6, threatening the pawn, and after g7, black collects the pawn with rook g6. White's best chance is to stay close to the pawn and wait with king g3. Since black's rook prevents the king from defending the pawn, and advancing the pawn loses for white, black can play the slow but effective plan of bringing the king into the game and attacking white's defenseless pawn. After the moves king b2, king f3, king b3, king g3, king b4, and king h3, Black plays king c5. If white continues to move the king, black will simply move the king over to white's pawn and capture it. As black's king blocks the rook from moving up the board, white races to promote the pawn with g6. Black's king moves closer to the pawn and opens up the rook's path to the back rank with king d6. White is only one move away from promoting after g7, but black's rook catches the pawn in time with rook c8. And after king g4, black collects the pawn with rook g8. Let's take a look at another example together. In this position, black's pawn on a3 is under attack. If black advances with a2, white wins the pawn by forking the pawn and king with rook a3 check. What should black do? It's important to remember that rooks belong behind passed pawns, not in front of them. Let's see what happens if black puts the rook in front of the pawn with rook a1. After king g3 and a2, black is threatening to play rook g1 check and promote the pawn on the next turn. White plays the important rook a3 check, placing the rook behind black's passed pawn. After black's king moves to safety with king b6, white needs to deal with black's threat of rook g1, checking the king and clearing the promotion square for the pawn. One idea is to play king f2. Although this move prevents any checks on the first rank, it turns out white has made a serious blunder. After rook h1, black is threatening to promote the pawn. The only way to prevent this threat is to play rook takes a2. White captures the pawn, but now the king and rook are lined up on the same rank, so black wins the rook with the skewer rook h2 check, capturing white's rook on the next turn. After king b6, white should play king g2, controlling the h1 square and preventing black's rook h1 trick. After king b5, king h2, white can safely move the king between h2 and g2 until black attacks white's rook with king b4. Since white's rook is behind the passed pawn, it can move all the way down the board with rook a8. The rook still puts pressure on black's pawn, and after king b3, once the king protects the pawn, threatening to move the rook off the promotion square, white simply checks the king with rook b8 check. If black tries to protect the pawn, white's rook will continue to check the king. If the king moves away from the pawn, such as with king c3, white simply returns to attacking the pawn with rook a8. Black cannot make progress, and the game is drawn. Since moving the rook in front of the passed pawn did not work out for black, a much better idea is to put the rook behind the passed pawn, starting with rook d4 check, gaining a tempo against the king to place the rook behind the pawn. After king g3, rook a4, black is ready to advance the pawn, so white quickly blocks the promotion square after rook c1, a2, rook a1. As we saw in previous examples, an active king is very important. Both sides rush to bring the kings to the action after king b6, king f3, king b5, king e3, king b4, king d2, and king b3. Black is ready to play king b2 and force the rook to move, but white's king prevents this with king c1. Has white saved the game? Not if black forces the king away from the critical b2 square with rook c4 check. After king d2 and king b2, black forces the rook to move and will promote the pawn on the next turn. Can you make the most of the rook in the endgame? Let's see.